The former head of Nigeria's Economic and Financial Crimes Commission made the point that if you attack corruption, it's the best way to attack poverty. I think also what's been interesting in the latest Global Integrity Report, this is an organization that monitors issues of integrity at the national level and the various anti-corruption mechanisms that hold governments accountable, and they've been doing a fairly worldwide presentation. And they highlight 3 flags, and I think you'd be interested, given what I've read in the press in the past few days, of what they see as a significant potential problem in terms of issues of integrity and corruption. One is where extremely poor conflicts of interest safeguards exist in government, and particularly in terms of its business interests. Weak oversight over large state-owned enterprises, and poor or non-existent controls over the flow of money into the political process. That's probably one of the big challenges internationally around issues of corruption and how decisions are often distorted at a political level by virtue of the lack of disclosure and transparency on political contributions. And I have to tell you, we talk about it in South Africa, but it's this bigger problem in some of the more developed countries, such as the United States, I would suggest. The trouble with systemic corruption is it's both difficult to analyze and to prescribe solutions, because it is such a politically charged issue, and it has so many different dimensions to it, as we heard yesterday. And the real question is what to do about it. The fallback position very often is around looking at regulation and regulatory bodies to solve the problem. And clearly it's important in order to address issues of corruption in a properly functioning society, you need to have strong public and private regulating institutions. The problem with that is that it's a complex and very costly exercise. And one of the things that we have to realize here is that we have to be realistic around what that implies, particularly in many of the developing countries, both in Africa and elsewhere, where there are so many other competing demands on a very limited national budget, issues of health, sanitation, water, and food security, and a range of other issues. And the result of that very often is issues around regulatory enforcement and the funding and establishment of effective regulatory agencies is often compromised or sacrificed at more immediate social priorities. One of the steps recommended by the World Bank's Doing Business survey, which has got a lot of publicity, is the ability to at least reduce the level of bureaucratic procedures that very often exist in many countries around the world. In Africa, with the exception of Mauritius, South Africa and Botswana, and to a lesser extent Namibia and Rwanda, that's been identified as a particular challenge. The advantage of a legal and regulatory framework, of course, is that it sets the minimum standards for acceptable conduct in doing business in that country and reflects what society holds as fair and appropriate behavior by all types and sizes of firms. But as I mentioned, the procedures are lengthy and costly. You just have to think about the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. It has some 3,700 employees. It has a massive budget, almost the size of the GDP of some small countries. And yet you still have the problems that are being reported almost daily, and as we've more recently spoken about, such as Goldman Sachs and the banking crisis that preceded the latest developments. So regulation and enforcement, and that's just one agency in a very complex economic and market environment. One of the points that was raised by the Advisory Board for Irish Aid was that many of the efforts by donor countries, these are governments supporting the activities against corruption and trying to put in the institutions, is that very often it's focused on creating and improving institutions of horizontal accountability, such as anti-corruption commissions, audit institutions, and so forth. But the problem is, not surprisingly, is that none of this is seen to be vastly successful at this current point in time. And that is largely because of the unwillingness of corrupt governments and government officials who clearly are the beneficiaries of the status quo. And so one of the challenges you have is how do you actually get into a system and actually change it in terms of those processes? How do you get effective reform processes without understanding the impact of and the effect on key players in that market? And that's one of the first and foremost challenges, because this is not just a private sector thing or just a public sector thing. To me, the two have to operate as best as can in unison. That then brings me to the international framework of standards and rules. And what worries me a little bit is that, notwithstanding what are a lot of very noble and profound efforts, is the sheer fragmentation of these numerous initiatives. And I'll come back to a more fundamental challenge that's associated with that. But foremost among these initiatives, which has been dealt with extensively, and I won't go into a lot of detail as was covered very thoroughly yesterday, is the UN Global Compact, of course. It's an unprecedented effort to coalesce the business community around a number of common principles in terms of global development through business practices and business leadership. The only thought I would have, and I'm sure that it's worth a discussion, is that I think there's some 6,000 or so signatories or companies that have signed to the Global Compact. When you think of the number of companies in existence internationally, that is just a smidgen of what really covers the corporate activity globally. On the other hand, of course, many of these companies are the world's best known and largest companies, and perhaps if you look at more their market capitalization in terms of the global GDP, maybe that effect may be to some extent, I would suggest, possibly diminished and not as a relevant argument perhaps. But notwithstanding, I think the efforts of the Global Compact are certainly to be commended, and are certainly in terms of it challenging a very politically contentious area such as corruption. One of the key areas of standard setting in terms of issues around corruption and corporate behavior, of course, is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is one of the organizations responsible for the establishment of the unit that are now head in Washington. And they are largely responsible for many of the official positions on issues of business integrity and corporate behavior, such as the OECD principles on corporate governance. What's interesting, at least in our work, is the amount of countries that are now seeking to address the shortcomings in their legal system by seeking to supplement this with corporate governance codes that address a very wide and diverse range of challenges that are very specific to each country, seeking to try and put in place practices that exceed the bare minimum legal requirements that exist on the statutes. I think what is important and what is becoming apparent, at least in many of the countries in which I work, is corporate governance is emerging not only as a tool that increases business efficiency, improves access to capital, and ensures sustainability of the business in its broadest sense, is that it's also emerging as an effective anti-corruption tool.